Today I'm going to talk to you about some really quite insignificant embellishments. I'm going to talk to you about the marks that readers make when they're reading, but my texts don't have extensive readers' commentaries, such as we've seen in the work of Heather Jackson's classical work on marginalia, or yesterday's excellent presentation from Karen Attar on some of the in-book commentaries left by Augustus de Moran. Rather, my work is concerned with small marks, underlinings, highlightings, and a few short comments left by multiple readers. And I'll talk to you about how I've used these and what they've revealed to me. So I'm an early modern historian, not a book historian, I must really confess up front. And my work is on 15th and 16th century physicians in Italy. And you can see some of them at work on the screen today. This is from the fresco in the Hospital of Santa Maria della Scala in Siena. In particular, I'm interested in their sense, in the sense of physicians' professional conduct, ethical standards, if you like, though I found that their sense of desirable conduct was much broader than what we might regard as ethics. This analysis is part of a broader project to understand what shaped the professional conduct of early modern physicians and how their conduct influenced their status in society. One of my key sources for the work was the books by three physicians who wrote on professional conduct. They were, and from left to right on the screen here, a section of a large multi-volume work by a Florentine physician named Niccolo Falcucci, and the beautiful 1484 edition that you can see here might look like an illuminated manuscript, but it is in fact a printed book. And it was provided with some hand-painted illuminations by the publisher. The other two are standalone books, that is, books dedicated in their entirety to conduct. The first by a Venetian physician, published in 1551, Giovanni Antonio Sicco, and the one on the right I'm going to spend most of my time on by a famous Paduan physician named Gabriele Zerbi. And the title there, just to give it out in full, is the very useful work on precautions for doctors, edited by the illustrious philosopher and Dr. Meister Gabriele Zerbi of Verona, who is the lecturer in theoretical medicine from the University of Padua in the year of our Lord 1495. All these works are in Latin, which is normal for texts of that period being written for an audience of similarly educated doctors, as you'd probably imagine. Now, doctors have been writing on the desirable conduct of doctors for centuries. You'll all know the Hippocratic Oath that states, for example, that the doctor will do no harm, amongst other things. But by the 15th century, books on conduct had evolved into much more detailed treatises on how to be successful in medical practice. They included the admonishments of the Hippocratic Oath, but also many more recommendations, for example, on how to handle difficult patients, how to handle fees, what to do when you don't know what to do, and how to manage your reputation as a doctor in society. In particular, they were worried about managing bad situations, such as a patient dying unexpectedly, and how to protect their reputation in those cases. Fascinatingly, I find similar books are still published today, and I find many of my medical acquaintances nodding along when I tell them what was recommended for Renaissance doctors. And there's a particular irony in the book by Gabriele Zerbi on the right here. It's a very detailed and very well-written account on how to be successful and avoid problems as a doctor. In 1505, 10 years after he wrote this little book, Zerbi was savagely murdered by the family of a patient who died under his care. That example does serve to focus the mind a little on the risks that doctors faced and why they might talk about the importance of protective measures in operating their practice and in developing their careers. Now, many medical texts of this period would start with a short section reminding the reader of their moral and religious duties. However, these three texts are much more extensive and detailed than most of this period. Each is only about 12,000 words on conduct alone. Falcucci's book is actually, I've taken 5 chapters out of a book that is something like 2 million words. Those 5 chapters dealing solely with conduct, but the others are all published as standalone texts, only 30 to 40 folio sides long. So in this little sub-project, to understand the influence of these works, I collected quite a large sample of the books I'm interested in. I gathered 13 copies of Falcucci's book, 30 copies of Zerbi's book, the one on the right, and 15 of Sicco's book, the one in the middle. And in using these, I was able to examine the number of editions printed, the type of copies produced, the number of copies produced, their physical distribution, and who owned them. And that told me quite a lot. But I was looking for more. I also found myself dealing with a bit of a dilemma, and that was this. Was anyone reading these texts? Were they written as a vanity project by the author, looking to perhaps promote their academic reputations, or were they actually read? And if they were read, what did the readers think of them? And that's what led me into this little project. So I turned to the marks that readers had left in the books. This is a good example. I hope you can see it up on the screen. You can see there's quite a lot of marks, but only a few comments. So the marginal comments themselves are always very interesting, but they're not very illuminating in the case of these books. They most commonly repeat a phrase from the text, or they may note a citation. For example, you may see a G if the text is talking about Galen, or perhaps just a nota, like the equivalent of an NB as we might have today. On their own, those comments weren't going to provide a lot of illumination on what readers thought about the work, but they did contain a lot of non-textual marks, such as underlinings, vertical brackets, rubrications, and these little manicules, these wonderful little hands pointing at bits of the text. So that's in contrast to the more classical analyses of marginalia that we've heard a lot about over the last few days, that tend to focus on the notes that readers write into their books. So you're really there focusing on the interaction between a reader and his or her book. So, for example, this is a copy of a book by the Roman historian Livy, very famous bit of scholarship by Anthony Grafton, which was exploring how Gabriel Harvey read his Livy. So you've got these extensive comments that he was able to read, analyze, and interpret, looking at what the reader thought. So a very different sort of analysis to what I'm seeing here. So my material is quite different. So you get a few comments, but a great many non-textual marks. So remember, my problem was to understand whether the books were read and understand what the readers thought about them. And in that context, these marks tell us quite a lot. They tell us, for a start, that someone did actually read the book. They actually opened it and at least read enough to warrant making a mark against the text. They tell us that they read that particular passage and that they were interested enough to make a mark. Some passages have a lot of marks and some have none. Given the number of copies I was able to find, I was able to apply some statistical techniques to the density and distribution of the marks, and that gave some very interesting results. But just to look at a few examples, the one up on the top left here is a copy of Falcucci's 1484 edition, and this is a little passage about the merits of attending the sick poor at no cost and working in hospitals for charity. And the reader here has said bona fama, which is a good reputational action. This would be good for the reputation to do this. On the bottom left, this is a passage on bad doctors. It describes how bad doctors seek to impress and confuse the common people using difficult words, speaking to them in Greek and Latin, and you can see the reader's been very interested in this. It has a comment here which says de malus medicus, so it's about bad doctors. So all this underlining, vertical bracket, really very interested in the characteristics of bad doctors. And finally, on the right, this passage is a copy from Zerby's 1494 edition, which discusses the importance of the innate quality of the doctor. It says that mere learning will not be enough unless the doctor has intrinsic abilities to build upon. In effect, he's saying that good doctors are born and not made. And the marginalia here, while it looks extensive, is really just repeating key points from the text. So what can we do with these marks? Firstly, we can compare the reader's actions between the three books, or beg your pardon, the reader's interactions between the three books that I introduced earlier. Remember, these books are all from around the same period, and they all deal with the same subject matter, and they were all by well-known physicians of their day. So my methodology here was to pass the text into paragraphs down to where each is dealing with a single point. It was an important step because then I could actually compare the same paragraph across multiple editions of the same text. There were several editions of at least two of these works. I was then able to count the number of marks for each paragraph, whether it was an underlining, a sidebar, or a manicule, and to look at the textual comments. So I was then able to look at the reader's interest by paragraph, chapters, and subject. But in going into that analysis, I already knew quite a bit. I already knew that Zerby's book had been published in 6 editions on the right. And I'd worked out that perhaps between 2,600 and 3,000 copies might have been produced of that work. And there's still quite a few of those extant today, about 35 copies of that, what is a very slim book still extant today, which is quite remarkable. Sicko's book on the left here there was only a single printing. So perhaps only 400 to 500 copies of that would have been printed, perhaps less. I've excluded Falcucci's work here, that beautiful book I showed you on the left before, as when you're actually looking at a broad volume with only a few chapters on conduct, you can't really do much with the distribution and printing of the whole work and relating that back to one subject that it contains. So I've excluded that. Simply difficulty trying to attach any particular significance to conduct. So the two standalone books were much more straightforward. Zerby's book had been found in libraries of physicians from Bari in southern Italy to France, Slovakia, Belgium, and Spain. But Sicko's was unknown outside of Venice. So then we come to an analysis of the marks themselves. And this graph gives you the density of marks per 100 words of text. And that includes copies with no marks at all. So it combines the number of books with marks and the density of marks within the books. So you can see that Zerby's book in the tall column in the middle had many more marks, a much higher density of marks, if you like, than other texts. In fact, 57% of those books had marks, often with a high density, while only, say, 20% of the copies of Sicko's book on the right there had any marks at all. So putting together the analysis of the printing, fewer editions, fewer copies made, and the analysis of readers' marks, particularly the density here, both indicate, for example, that Sicko's book was unpopular with contemporaries, while Zerby's book attracted quite a strong following. You can't really tell from this whether it was people liked it or not, but it was attracting interest. But because the paragraph was the unit of my analysis, you can also look at what parts of the text were engaging the attention of readers. So this graph shows the density of readers' marks by chapter in Zerby's book. And on the right there, I've just given a quick guide to what the chapters contained. You'll see there's a number of chapter 4s and chapter 5s. It's because the author actually breaks them down into sort of sub-chapters, but for the sake of simplicity, I've just sort of given the subject of the whole chapter. So what does this tell us? The most important thing is that it tells us that readers tended to finish the book. Their level of interaction is remaining fairly steady through the text, with none of the sort of falling off you might expect if they were losing interest and just sort of setting the book aside halfway through. And just as a way of contrasting that, this is the same graph for Sicko's book with the same scale, which was density. So Sicko doesn't have chapters. He just has a sort of stream of consciousness approach to his work. So I've analysed it here by page, and you can see that, beg your pardon. You can see that while it's only a small sample, only 3 copies of his book had marks. But you can see that he didn't really maintain the interest of their readers with both the preface and the last quarter of the book only had a very small number of marks. And I have to say, when I read the book, I must admit I felt the same. It's a very rambling account and very boring to read compared to the other books. So he wasn't really engaging his readers in the way that, for example, Zerbe had, and to a lesser degree, Falcucci, though. I'm not really going to give you the details of that today for the sake of time. Okay. In the interest of time, I'm now only going to focus on that one book by Zerbe, which has the greatest evidence of reader interaction. And I hate to give you this graph. It's the busiest graph I'm going to inflict on you today. Let me just explain to you a moment. It shows by paragraph the interaction that readers were having with Zerbe's book. And it shows the number of readers who marked up a particular paragraph, and they're shown by the orange bars. And it shows how many marks they made in that paragraph, and that's in this sort of very zigzaggy, dark dashed line. The grey dashed line is 50% of all readers. So when the orange bar goes over the grey line, that means that more than 50% of readers made a mark in that paragraph. So that's a lot of complexity there, I know, but let me sort of cut to the chase with it. What you can see here, there's a lot of variation in the paragraphs that readers engage with some that they seem particularly engaging with, and some very little or not at all. I've highlighted here in the text a few examples of the types of subjects that seem to catch the attention of readers. And the paragraphs that engage them are themselves very interesting. The most popular one was the one that listed the virtues the doctor should avoid and the vices to avoid. I beg your pardon. The virtues the doctor should demonstrate and the vices to avoid in order to be a good doctor. So let's just have a quick look at that text. This is that paragraph. And this is the most popular paragraph by a long margin, was actually the one on the vices to avoid. And you can see the example on the right. Each of these little underlinings is a vice. So you can probably see blasphemy there, phalanx to be a liar, crapulous, contumelosis. So these are all of the vices. And basically, Zerbe says, in order to be a good doctor, you must not do these things. So you must not excessively pursue honours. You must not be stingy or greedy. You must not blaspheme, etc., etc., etc. And this paragraph attracted 4 times as many marks as the next most popular one, which listed the virtues that a physician should show. Interesting. So you could sort of, you could perhaps imagine that the physician sort of going through here going, yeah, well, perhaps I'm guilty of that one. No, I don't do that one. And underlining as they went through, sort of checking off in their mind how they were going against Zerbe's list of positive and negative personal attributes. Another one that was very popular was the risks of using certain strong medications, such as opiates or strong purgatives. And the reader is warned that drugs purchased from an apothecary might be impure or old, or might indeed be fakes. Elsewhere, Zerbe goes on to recommend that the doctor should use a trusted apothecary well known to them. And even so, the doctor should be present when drugs are prepared to ensure they're of good quality and not too strong. The danger being, of course, this is well before any sort of standardization of medication. A strong dose might kill the patient. One reader notes optima cautela, or best precaution, in the margin of that one. So a number of these tips on how to avoid trouble and how to be effective in practice really did catch the interest of readers. So remember remember the problem that I was trying to work through in understanding these texts. I was trying to understand, did contemporaries read them, and were there particular subjects that engaged their interest? What did they think of it? So what can we take away from this analysis of the embellishments? Remember, they're books advising doctors on how to conduct themselves and be successful in their practice. So what did readers think? So for this forum, my key point is that a lack of legible readers' comments need not be an obstacle to understanding how readers interacted with a text. Given a sufficient sample, we can tell a lot about readers' engagements from the non-legible marks that they leave in a text. And in my case, firstly, we can see clear evidence that contemporaries did read the texts. In fact, with a suitable methodology, I was able to make useful empirical comparisons between different texts and across different editions dealing with the same subject. Secondly, we can see which parts of the text garnered the most interest from readers, right down to specific areas of interest. So back to these research questions. Firstly, we can say that readers did engage with all three texts, although they clearly engaged much more strongly with Zerby's little book than with the others. And in conjunction with the analysis of printing and distribution of the books, I was able to form a view of Zerby's book as quite popular with readers, if not a bestseller based on its volumes of sales, while Sicko's book, by contrast, was not very popular at all and not a very exciting read for those who did read it. So in terms of the readers' interests, readers were interested in the attributes of a good doctor and the attributes to be avoided to be a good doctor, and the precautions to be followed to avoid reverses in their reputation and their fortune. Clearly, I already knew that the text covered these areas, but knowing what specific subjects excited the interest of contemporary readers and which did not gives me a much more precise and nuanced picture of their views and professional conduct. I hope you found that interesting, and I'll be very interested in your questions. Thank you.